Good evening and welcome. I'm Carolyn White, and I am now currently working with the City Club of Southern Idaho. And so we want to welcome you to our first in-person event in probably 2 years or longer. So we're glad to see that there are people interested out there and have come to our presentation. We are also live streaming this tonight as well, so it will be on a live stream YouTube. And so I wanted to make one quick announcement for the people that are out there on the live stream, in that if you have a question for our presenters this evening, you can address them to the following email. It's president@csi.edu. Okay, I'd like to thank the College of Southern Idaho for hosting our event this evening, as well as Dr. Fisher, who will also be our question monitor. The format we'll follow tonight is that our presenters will present the information. They will talk about it, highlight the information, and kind of explain maybe some of what the survey covered and the material. And then we will collect all your questions, and then Dr. Fisher will present those questions to our presenters. So tonight's presentation is on the future of democracy and how it looks in the Intermountain West. This was based on a survey that was conducted in 2021 throughout the 5 states in the Northwest. So without further ado, I would just like to mention that our motto for City Club is promoting community through civil discord. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenters this evening. Dr. Rod Gramer, who is President and CEO of Idaho Business for Education, and Dr. Vanessa Fry. She is Interim Director of Idaho Policy Institute and Associate Research Professor at the School of Public Service at Boise State University. So thank you and welcome.
All right, we are live. Thanks to everyone in the audience and for those of you online for joining us. We are going to get right into it. What we're going to present this evening and talk specifically about are the results of the research for Idaho. We did do this in 5 states, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, and Montana. But we thought it'd be really important for us to focus on Idaho, since we are in Idaho. And the results weren't that much different across all the states. So the full survey itself was conducted last fall. We surveyed about 2,000 people, so about 400 individuals in each of those states. And there was a representative sample of the individuals in those states. And I've got someone back there advancing my slides. There we go. And so we're going to talk about the state of democracy next. So these are the different sections we're going to talk about, and how Rod and I are going to have a conversation tonight is I'll present the data, and then Rod's going to dig into what does this data actually mean. And so we're going to talk about first the health of democracy. Next. So we started off the survey asking people how concerned they were, if at all, about the health of democracy in each of the following. We were really curious about how they felt about their state in general. So here we're thinking of Idaho, and then the United States as a whole. So you can see, if we look at the part of the pie charts that are colored red, the vast majority of people, both in the Idaho, looking at the state itself, and the country, were really concerned about the state of democracy. Do you want to say anything about that?
Sure.
Okay.
Just think of Vanessa and I as commentators for a basketball or a football game. She's doing the play-by-play, and I'm doing the color commentary. So she's Al Michaels, and I'm Chris Collinsworth. And
Alan Chris.
Yeah. To me, this is one of the one of the most important slides, and it really. It's when you first see this, that 87% of Idahoans are concerned about the health of democracy in our country. I mean, that's amazing when you can get Democrats, Independents, Republicans to almost 9 out of 10 to say that they're concerned about the health of democracy. And what's really also interesting is that almost 6 out of 10 are concerned about the democracy in our state. So, they're both concerned about what it is nationally and locally. And it's not surprising. I think we were talking on the way down today, if we did the same survey in New England, which is kind of the polar opposite of the Intermountain states, we'd probably find very similar feelings about the state of democracy in our country.
All right, thanks. Next. So we know that they're concerned. We wanted to know why they were concerned. And so we asked a set of questions about different topics and how concerning they found each of these topics. And so you can see at the top here, the spread of misinformation, money in politics, politically motivated violence, the influence of elites, media, and then political polarization. Those all were about at 50% or higher of people saying very concerning. But then if we look a little bit further, I mean, really, we're aiming up at about between 60 and 75% of people or more are saying it's concerning in general. So somewhat concerning or very concerning.
Yeah, I think, Vanessa, I think if we could just go to the next slide, because we do a really deep dive in each of those areas, which I think would be pretty informative.
Yeah, and I don't know if that slide is in this updated. This one?
Yeah, this is
the confidence. Okay.
This kind of touches on the first thing, and the question is, how much confidence do you have that these various entities are acting in the best interests of the public? And you'll see here in Idaho that the question is not much or not at all. 6 out of 10 Idahoans think that the federal government is not acting in their best interest. 62% say that Congress isn't. 64% say the president isn't. People have more confidence in the state government. 59% says the state government is working in their interest. And you'll see this throughout this, that the local governments, our school boards, our city councils, county commissions, they fare darn well in this survey. They do have their problems too, but 62% of Idahoans say their local government is working in their interest. And also they have a lot of confidence in the Supreme Court and in justices. I'm not very surprised by this because for a couple reasons. First of all, most of you know this, that Idahoans have a love-hate relationship with the federal government. 60+% of our state is federal. We all love to hike and fish and hunt and ski and all those things in our federal lands. At the same time, we sometimes see the federal government as absentee landlords. So it's this tug of war that Idahoans have had, since statehood, really, with the federal government. So that doesn't surprise me a lot. And the lack of confidence in Congress and President, I think, is also pretty understandable because we're such a heavily Republican state. I think if the president was Republican, the Congress was controlled by the Republican Party, we'd probably see that confidence level a little higher than it is. So I'm not surprised that in a state so overwhelmingly Republican that the view of the president, the current president, current Congress would be pretty low.
Yeah, thanks. Next. So one of the things we were really curious about is how fairly people thought they were treated and how others were treated. And so when we think about money in politics, and it might be related to certain things like the elites, so we asked to indicate if they believed the following groups were getting treated fairly or unfairly by each part of government, so federal, state, and local. And so we looked at elites, people in urban areas, everyday people, and people in rural areas. And we were really curious to see if they thought a group was more favored. And you can see across the board that people thought the elites were treated more fairly by all levels of government.
Yeah, and this is one that I think you're really seeing all across the United States, where there's a real feeling that elites, however you define that, it could be politicians, it could be the media, it could be it could be higher education, it could be education in general. I mean, the elites, the American people, and clearly in Idaho, have a feeling that the elites are being treated much more fairly than average people. And the other theme you see here is you're starting to see in this slide the urban-rural divide, which we really have in Idaho. You have it in the legislature, you see it in how people are thinking about things, where in this case, people think the people in the rural or the urban areas are treated more fairly by all levels of government than the people in the rural areas. And then you see the everyday people feel like they're not being treated fairly at virtually every level, although again, local government, state government does much better than federal government. And people in the rural areas especially feel like they're not being treated fairly than the elites and the people in the urban areas.
Great, thanks, Rod. Next slide. So to kind of tell you why we were thinking about this and asking this, we were really focusing on the tenets of democracy. And one of those is the feeling of connectivity and do you feel you have representation in government? So, and so we were curious about how close people felt to different levels of government or if they felt alienated from different levels. And so again, we see the federal government rising to the top as most often and sometimes people are feeling quite alienated from federal government. And I think one of the things we've talked about is, that may have changed over time. We really aren't connected to our elected officials that are in Washington, D.C. as much as maybe we used to be. They're not home that much. And then you can see as we get closer to home, people feel less alienated from their local elected officials.
Yeah, and this is pretty striking. And the federal, first of all, I think alienation is a really strong word. I mean, it's a pretty strong word, and clearly the people of Idaho, 75% feel alienated by the federal government. They're also checking out on politics, 68%. But what really surprised me about this slide was the fact that they think they're alienated 5%, 63% from our members of Congress, our 2 congressmen, our 2 senators. That really surprised me because the people that represent us in Congress are pretty much lifelong politicians in Idaho. I've known Risch and Crapo and Mike Simpson since, I've known Risch since the 70s, but I mean, they've been in office a long, long time. Russ Fulcher in the 1st District, less so, but for that many people of all parties and independents feeling alienated by our representatives in Congress, that was pretty darn surprising to me. But like Vanessa said, the state government and local government, where it's closer to the people, you see people at the grocery store, see them at church, they feel closer to that. And I guess it's like Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local, but your state representatives and your local government people do much better. And one thing I'd like to just add on that is, and maybe it'll come up in other slides too, I'm very impressed by the fact that people have more confidence in their local government. But I'm really, really concerned about the trend we're on. For the first time I think in the history of our state, at least the modern history, we are politicizing our local elections. The November election was the first local election I've ever seen where school board races, city council races that are always been nonpartisan were politicized. And there's even a movement afoot. I read it over the weekend in other states. Hasn't hit Idaho yet, but I expect it to probably hit by next session. They want to require all school boards to run partisan. So if you run for the school board, you got to run as a Republican or you have to run as a Democrat. And what concerns me about that is that we all know how much dysfunction there is in Washington, D.C. I mean, it's like totally dysfunctional, polarized, they can't get much done. And I'm starting to see that more and more in the Idaho legislature And I would really hate to see that start infecting local governments too. Because local governments, where you keep the buses running on time, you make sure the schools have heat and lights, and it's really closest to the people, and the people's lives really depend on whether that EMT shows up at your door. So anyway, that trend really concerns me as an observer of Idaho politics.
So you can see a trend. We're concerned about a lot of things, but at the end we do have some positive news.
As I said, the movie's going to end on a happier note.
Yes. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now we're going to get into media and information. Again, when we think about the tenets of democracy, a free and open press is one of those, one that's not controlled by politicians. And so next one. So we were curious about people's general concerns about misinformation and misrepresentation of facts. And you can see, again, in both those categories, all of our respondents were quite concerned, either very worried or somewhat worried on both these issues.
Of all the slides in the survey, this one probably tugs at my heartstrings the most, because I spent almost 4 decades in journalism. And what concerns me about this is, I've often said this to students of journalism, that the founding fathers had in the U.S. Constitution, they only mentioned one profession in the whole Constitution. That is the press. And the founding fathers believed that a free, independent press was fundamentally important to our republic and to our democracy. And that's why they put it in the Constitution, the free flow of ideas and facts. Because in a democracy, you cannot really have a democracy if you don't believe information, if you don't have facts. And what's really disturbing to me is that 84% are worried about the misinformation they get, and then 86% are concerned about the misrepresentation of facts. And that's, again, Republicans, Democrats, Independents. And that's almost 100%. And so if people don't have confidence in the information, how can they make informed decisions in a democracy? So this is, to me, really, really concerning. And I have my theories about this. The rise of social media, the rise of 24-hour news, which I think is the worst thing that ever happened to journalism. And just the way that in the early days of our republic, there were Federalist newspapers, there were Republican, Democratic, the Jeffersonian newspapers, and they battled it out. And it was vicious back in the early days of our republic. And we're kind of getting to that again now, where we've got the conservative, far right 24-hour news, we've got the liberal 24-hour news, and everybody's sort of going into their echo chamber, and their ideas are being sort of reaffirmed by what they're watching. So anyway, this is a very, very concerning trend, I think.
All right, next slide. So we were curious as to what our respondents thought as to who was the responsible party when it came to misinformation. And so we gave these choices: the liberal media, conservative media, both, or neither, or don't know. And what you're seeing to some extent here is the reflection of the parties, how people identify in Idaho. But we're seeing a lot of blame put on both of them as well.
Yeah, I think this is maybe positive. I think people are smart enough to know that both the liberal and both the conservative media is to blame here, and I think that's refreshing that almost 50% blame both. And not surprisingly, because we are a conservative state, 25% blame liberal media for both misinformation and misrepresentation of the facts, and 11% blame conservative. But I think it's really, a positive silver lining that the people are smart enough to know that it's both.
Although there's little trust, right, in that. So
no trust, but
Yeah.
at least they are putting the blame probably where it belongs.
Yeah. Next slide, please. Okay, so now, again, free and open elections that are accessible is a tenet of a democracy. And so we're going to look at these next pieces of slides here. And so we're looking in general about the 2020 election originally. So we asked, do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Claims that the November 2020 U.S. presidential election had widespread election fraud and the results were not decided fairly, and that they therefore undermined my confidence in democracy. And so, again, this is just reflective of Idahoans that responded, and you see that 59% say they either strongly agree or somewhat agree with that statement, whereas only 28% say they don't agree.
Yeah, this too is very concerning. I mean, 59% of Idahoans don't have confidence in the last election and don't think it was decided fairly. And if we believe that any election is not fair, then it's really hard for whoever wins that election to govern in a legitimate way, at least in the view of the people. So when you think, I look across the room and from what I see a lot of hair that looks a little bit like my hair. So I have to assume that you all have been voting about as long or longer than I have. And there isn't a time in my lifetime where the American people didn't accept the results of the election. I mean, if you go back to Gore and George W. Bush in 2000, Gore won the popular vote. President Bush won the electoral vote. It was really decided, even that was decided in the U.S. Supreme Court. As you know, Gore conceded once the Supreme Court ruled, and it was the end of that. Nobody really questioned whether George Bush was our president or not. And at least in modern American history, no election, in my memory, was ever questioned. If you're a Democrat and the Republican won, you accepted that the person was president. You didn't like it, but you accepted it. And conversely, if you're a Republican and the Democrat won, you didn't like it, but you accepted it. This is the first election, I think, I can't speak for the 1800s, but I think it's the first election since the dawn of the 20th century where the results of this election have been in dispute. And I think that's a scary, we should all be concerned about that, because next time it could be a Republican that's elected, and the country could reject that. And it's kind of a side issue, but 2 elections in the 21st century have been decided by the Electoral College and not by popular vote. I'm personally concerned about that because in a democracy, if we keep having elections where the one candidate wins the electoral vote, the other one wins the popular vote, I think that's also a blow to our democracy.
Yeah, and maybe part of that mistrust in what's going on. Next slide, please. So then we specifically asked by name, which we didn't intentionally do in the previous slide. Do you believe that former Vice President Joe Biden legitimately defeated incumbent President Donald Trump in the November 2020 presidential election? And so a little bit different results than we saw in the previous slide. 45% said they do believe it was legitimate, and 44% said no, it's not. I won't get into, I guess I'm stealing Rod's thunder here on my commentary, but essentially 50-50, with 11% saying they don't know or don't have an opinion about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing that 44% don't think Biden won legitimately. But when you add, people that didn't have an opinion on it, that's pretty stark. So you're really looking at 55% that either think he didn't or they're not sure. So that's a pretty solid majority. Macron just won by 58% of the vote, and any politician in the world would love to win by 55% of the vote, but 55% of Idahoans really don't think he's legitimate.
And again, this may be reflective of the voters in Idaho,
Oh, yeah,
right? So if
definitely.
we did this poll in a more liberal-leaning state, we might see this look different. But
Yeah.
we concentrated on those western states, and the responses we saw in those states were pretty similar for this question.
Yeah, I think if we did this question in Oregon, Washington, Massachusetts, it'd probably be flipped, at least. And really, one of the things we should say is the reason we did this survey in the 5 Intermountain states is because we're often ignored by national pollsters. We're the so-called flyover states, and we really wanted to know what people in our Intermountain region thought about this. So, so these results do reflect our politics in the Intermountain West, and we have to keep that in mind because if you did this in another area, the results could be different.
Next slide. So we learned that there's mistrust and people don't believe that the election was legitimate. And so we wanted to know why. What are the reasons why people think that it wasn't legitimate? And so you can see here, and we did split this out by party. So you can see on the right-hand side by party, but people voted illegally, the election was rigged, people were discouraged or prevented from voting, or there was foreign interference in the election. And so we chose these because this was the narrative we were hearing quite often after the election. And so we were curious as to how different people felt about it.
So this is really the slide where you see a lot of partisanship showing up. The Democrats, the blame for voting illegally, 80% of Republicans in Idaho said people were voting illegally, only 13% of Democrats. The question about the election being rigged, 13% of Democrats said it was rigged, but 73% of Republicans said it was rigged. And then people discouraged, you saw basically in both parties, they thought people were discouraged from voting, 48% of Republicans and 45% of Democrats. What I really found interesting in this question is how much foreign interference, which is what the Democrats have been saying all along, is that Russia was interfering in our elections and Republicans less so. But in this survey, 58% of the Republicans said that there was foreign interference and only 26% of the Democrats did. So that was a really surprising result for me.
Okay, next slide, please. So this was probably another one of the pieces of information that we were surprised by and maybe weren't sure that there was a positive thing we were seeing here. And I pulled all of the states so you can see, but we wanted to know, this is the question we asked, which of the following statements is closer to your opinion, even if neither is exactly right? So political violence is justified in a democracy when you believe things have gotten so bad that the government is not acting in the best interests of the people, or political violence is not justified in a democracy, the better solution is the ballot box.
So there is good news here. Of the 5 states, Idaho was the second highest that said that the violence was not justified at 58%. Only Utah, our neighbors in Utah, said it wasn't at 59%. What's really striking here, though, is when you think about it, that 17% of our neighbors said violence is justified, and 21% said they didn't know. Now that's a pretty easy, really, don't you think that's a pretty easy question? I'm not a pollster expert, but I'm thinking that's a pretty easy, it's justified or it's not justified, it's violence. And yet 21% said they didn't know. That is 38% of our friends and neighbors that either think it's justified or they can't say that it's not justified. And that's a lot of people, really. That's like if 10 of us were in the room, there'd be 4 people that couldn't answer that question, it's not justified. It's pretty scary.
Yeah. Next slide, please. Okay, and then we specifically asked about the violence that occurred at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th in 2021, and gave specifics. That the violence disrupted a joint session of Congress convened to certify the results of the November 2020 presidential election and threatened those in the Capitol. And we asked the respondents, thinking about the violence at the U.S. Capitol, generally, do you believe the actions of those involved were justified? And so if you look on the left-hand side here, 15% of respondents said definitely or probably that the violence was justified.
Yeah, and that's another case where you had 15% saying it was definitely or probably, and 13% saying they didn't know. Again, that's 28%, so almost 30%, almost a third of our neighbors. And I don't know if it's this slide, but I think it is. If you look at the overall number on January 6th, 72% of Idahoans said it was not justified. But if you break it down by party, you start seeing that that partisan divide again. 89% of the Democrats said it wasn't justified, 80% of independents, but only 57% of Republicans said it wasn't justified. So you've got another 43% of Republicans that apparently think it was justified.
Next slide. So after that, we wanted to know that is this likely to occur again? So we asked, in your view, how likely or unlikely is it that U.S. sees violence in the future of government officials or buildings similar to the violence at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021? And again, we're showing you the results from all 5 states. So again, do people think that this is going to happen again? Something similar to the violence on January 6th is going to happen again?
So 61% of the 5-state region said yes. Our friends up in Montana are more pessimistic than the rest of us. 69% say that they think it'll happen again, compared to only 59% of Idahoans. And again, we're the second lowest. Wyoming, they're a little bit more optimistic. 57% say it's going to happen again, but we're at 59%.
All right, next slide, please. Okay, so let's find some common ground here, right? We said that there was going to be a positive ending to this movie. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so we might not get to the positive right away, but I promise you we'll get there. It's coming.
It's the next
Just
slide.
wait. Okay, so the question we asked, generally, do you believe that Americans of different political viewpoints have a difficult time or an easy time talking to one another about politics? Not very many people said it was easy, right? So we said about 13% of our respondents said it was easy, where we see 80% of people saying, wow, this is really hard. It's really hard.
Yeah, I think your response to this probably tells the whole story without me saying anything. But I imagine a lot of people had very uncomfortable conversations around the Thanksgiving Day table last fall and maybe at the Christmas table. So clearly people are having trouble. You know, it's pretty obvious that people are having trouble talking to each other about things.
Okay, so we know people are having a hard time talking to one another, but how do we want our elected officials to talk with one another? And so, oh, wait a minute, this is the right, oh, next slide, sorry. There we go, okay. So we know people have a hard time talking to one another. We wanted to know how people wanted their elected officials to act. And so we asked, which of these 2 attributes is more important to you? 1, an elected official who finds compromise and common ground between political parties, or an elected official who stands their ground and pushes their agenda. And so what we see here, this is a little bit of a bright light, right? 70% of respondents said they want to see an elected official who finds compromise.
So this is my favorite slide in the whole study because it's really positive and it's very hopeful. And I think it's important for us as Idahoans to have hope and faith and optimism about the future, if not for our sake, for the sake of our kids. And clearly, the people of Idaho in all parties want our elected officials to find common ground. I always follow the mantra, if you can find common ground, you can find compromise, and it can lead to the common good. And it's so heartening that 7 out of 10 Idahoans feel that way. But the problem I see is that we don't always elect people who reflect that. I'm sure you're seeing the TV ads that I'm seeing. I'm sure you're seeing your mailbox stuffed full of election brochures right now. And there's not much positive about those brochures. It's like tearing down the other person instead of really talking about what they believe. And instead of really focusing on the kitchen table issues that everyday Idahoans are concerned about, they go right for the jugular on these issues that are inflammatory. So, and the issues that are the hardest ones to find compromise on. So what's really ironic, I think, is that Idahoans want our elected officials to find common ground, but we keep electing folks who don't try to find common ground, regardless of party, not just in Idaho, but across the country. So there's a disconnect between what we think we want and what we keep buying. It's almost like you're going to the grocery store, instead of buying the food you really want to eat, you're buying the food that you really don't want to eat. But I don't know. There could be a lot of metaphors there, right?
Yeah, and this is this slide. This piece of data from the project I was really hopeful about too, because one of the reasons I got engaged in the project is, and we haven't tested this fully, and I'm hoping to do it in future research, is I don't think we're that different. When it comes down to it, I think that we all have a lot of common values. We love our families for the most part, right? We want our kids to have opportunities. We want our own economic opportunities. We don't necessarily agree on how to get those to happen, right? We don't agree. So, so let's go to the next slide, strengthening democracy. Okay, next slide. So we gave the respondents a set of options of, which of the following things, if anything, would help strengthen democracy. So really thinking about, okay, what can be done? We know that people are concerned about democracy, but what are the pieces that we can really focus on?
Yeah, I find this slide very positive. And the reason I find it positive is because this is a blueprint that the people are giving us for what we could do to start moving in a different direction. And at least at the top 5 or 6 of these, there's a consensus between Democrats and Republicans, and I'd assume independents, on what we need to do. And whenever you can find Democrats and Republicans that can find consensus, that's the low-hanging fruit. That's what we as people of Idaho should grab, because if we can get people of various parties to agree on what we need to do, then we can start moving in a more positive direction. So the top ones, of course, are holding politicians accountable for ethical and illegal behavior. That's really low-hanging fruit, right? And there's strong agreement on that, 67%. And then the second one is holding our politicians accountable for campaign promises. 57%. Term limits, which the people of Idaho passed a few years ago. I don't know if you recall. And the legislature in the very next session repealed it. But I will add that nobody paid a price for that. That kind of goes back to we want common ground, and then we elect people that do the opposite. In this case, people passed term limits, but nobody paid the price. Nobody lost their job because of that repeal. Reduce money in politics, almost 50%. And the last one, which I have a little bit of angst over, which is regulate misinformation. The problem with that is, because I'd really love to regulate it, but who's going to be the regulator, And that's where the founders had such wisdom. They didn't want the state, they did not want the government. Lord knows they didn't want the politicians to regulate what we read, what we heard. All you have to do right now is look at Russia. The Russian people don't know what's going on in Ukraine right now. And it's because the state controls the information. Here in the West, where we're democracies, we can see the pictures. I laugh every time that, I don't laugh, I actually cry every time a Russian ambassador or foreign minister says, oh, we're doing this for such and such region, we're going to liberate these people, and nothing bad is happening. And I always say, how stupid do the Russians think we are? We see the pictures, right? So, but in Russia, the people don't see the pictures. And that's because the state controls it. So I have a little bit of angst over the idea that we're going to find somebody who's going to regulate information. I'd like to think that we can become wiser citizens in our media consumption. And that might be a better way to get to that. But anyway.
There's two responses on here that are lately highlighted in blue, and that's because we're at a place of education here. We're both associated with Boise State University, and so these are the two pieces that we thought that maybe there's an opportunity for higher education to engage. So encourage conversations between individuals with different political views, and add more civics education in schools in the U.S. On government and politics. So, there's certain places where it makes sense for our institutions of higher education, and specifically sometimes the Frank Church Institute, to really kind of dig in and support a stronger democracy.
So I've been given a lot of thought because the research is so insightful, but what do we do with it? I mean, what can we do? And there's a group nationally called Braver Angels. And it's got 55,000 members across the country. And it started out being called Better Angels, but then that was what Lincoln referred to in his first inaugural address. Somebody has apparently trademarked that, so they told him stop using that. So they called themselves Braver Angels. But they're nonpartisan, and they create these small groups across the country where they bring in Republicans, they bring in Democrats and independents, and they talk to each other in a civil way. And they talk about issues, they talk about, understanding the other person's point of view. And lo and behold, they find that there's a lot of common ground. Now, they may disagree necessarily on how to get there, but they agree in the values and they agree on the goal. And we have a chapter here in Idaho, actually, and people can get trained to facilitate these Braver Angels sessions. And I think there's a role for something like that. And I think the Church Institute, Boise State, maybe the other colleges and universities could play a real role in bringing us together as Idahoans around the table so that we can talk to each other, listen to each other, really understand each other, and try to find common ground. If we can find common ground, which the founders of our country, they predicated the entire system of government on compromise in our country. They expected us to compromise. And if we can find compromise, find common ground, we can find a way forward out of the swamp that we're in. And we're in a big swamp right now, so in my view, but anyway.
All right, and I've got one more wrap-up slide, and then we'll go to the Q&A. So, overall key findings, and again, this was reflective not just in Idaho, but in all 5 states. So, in Idaho, though, most adults are concerned about the health of democracy, both at the national level and right here in Idaho. Regarding the Idahoans, they're concerned about fairness in government representation, the spread of information, and then political polarization and violence. And then as far as thinking about the future and what can we do to address this concern with democracy, really finding common ground like Rod was just talking about, and believing in the effectiveness of both related to structural reform and grassroots efforts. So that is the end of our data presentation. I think the president is going to facilitate a Q&A. And I should say that City Club is also a great place for civil dialogue. So, how can we have these tough conversations more across our state? And City Club here in the Magic Valley and up in the Boise area too.
Yeah, we have 3 city clubs now in Idaho. Boise started back in the 90s. Idaho Falls has a city club, and you all have a city club. And it's a great way to foster civil and respectful dialogue.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and get the question that's been buzzing around in my head, and then I'll try and make sense of these questions. And I'm not making sense of them because Dr. Tremaine handed them to me. I just want to read them and try and make sure I understand the question. But one of the criticisms of moving away from the Electoral College has been that rural states, less populated areas don't have as much influence, and you can focus on the New York Cities or the Los Angeles of the world. Talking about information and the flow of it, I'm more concerned about what I see happening with social media, that between Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos owning New York Times now, you've got this handful of people that can control information very significantly. So how do we get to good information? How do we assure good information literacy in a world where people can control what we believe?
Yeah, I'm really concerned about what I'd call the consolidation of the media. I mean, I've always been concerned about that. I've worked for big media companies. I've worked for small media companies. I've worked for locally owned media companies. The consolidation of the media has been going on for years, and especially corporations buying TV stations and buying newspapers. We've seen that since the 60s. But what we're seeing now is something new, and that is consolidation of the media in the hands of one individual. And so consolidation of the media in the hands of one individual. So if you look at the powerful media, one of the reasons newspapers are dying and one of the reasons even TV is suffering is because of the advent of social media and the advent of Facebook. Facebook and Google have been taking away a lot of the advertising that used to support local media. And so Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg owns Facebook, controlled by one guy. You've got Google, you've got Amazon with Bezos. And then you've got this trend that just happened yesterday where Elon Musk buys Twitter. And when Twitter came out, I was still in the news business, a lot of this social media stuff I didn't see a lot of value in, but I saw Twitter originally, not anymore, as kind of what the AP news bulletins used to be. In fact, I'll tell you a story. I was sitting at home, and I was still an executive news director, and I got a text from my son, who was in college in Washington, D.C., and it was that Osama bin Laden had been killed. Now, I'm in the news business, right? I'm having my son 3,000 miles away telling me that he was killed. And I texted back, I said, how do you know? He said, it was on Twitter. So I called the newsroom to alert the newsroom that, so I looked at Twitter, I said, this is a great way to get information out, right? But it's become this swamp of misinformation, and foreign countries are using it. And so I'm really concerned, President, about the consolidation of this in the hands of some very powerful people who may not have the best interest of the people in mind.
And I'm just going to add to that, as a mother of 2 young girls, so I did not grow up in an era of social media, and I'm now, and us as parents and grandparents, how do we teach our children who never really saw media other than what it is today to know what's the truth? And that's a huge challenge. And so I think, again, whether it's our elementary schools, our junior highs, our high schools, and our colleges, how do we teach our students to decipher truth from fiction? And I don't think we're there yet. That's one. And then how do we get our youth to not be addicted to this 24-hour stream of other people's opinions and misinformation? And that's a huge challenge that, again, when you have it privatized in the hands of a couple people that make money off of it, they want it to be something that your kid doesn't want to put down. And that becomes challenging.
Yeah, and you know, I think we need more media education in our schools, whether starting in elementary school, middle school, high school, age appropriate, of course, where we can teach our kids to think critically about what they're reading and what they're consuming. But the other thing that that I think we have to be mindful of is that what's happening on social media right now, Idaho. Well, first of all across the United States, the mental health crisis among our youth is bad, and suicide among our youth is high. Idaho, we have the highest. A study just came out last October. We have the highest mental health problem in the country with our youth in the state of Idaho, and we have one of the highest youth suicide rates in the United States. We had. Over in Ada County, we had 2 fifth graders that killed themselves separately, incidents, last fall, and it just struck me. It was terrible. And the study that came out in October said we have the least access to mental health services in Idaho for our youth. So a lot of this is caused by what they're seeing, what their friends are saying to them about on social media. President, could I tackle that that electoral college question? Because I think I have a controversial point of view on this thing, if that's okay.
I suspect everything we've talked about tonight is in some ways controversial. No, by all means, I was trying to frame it.
The founders set that up so that the smaller states would not be at a disadvantage to the larger states. But what's happened, in my view, on the electoral college is that if you live in Oregon and you're a Republican, your vote doesn't matter. I mean, really doesn't matter. And if you live in Idaho and you're a Democrat, your vote doesn't matter. And there's virtually no state in the country, we have a few purple states, but not very many anymore, where it might matter one election, not matter the next. But if you live in Oregon and you're a Republican, it never counts. And if you're Democrat in Idaho, it never counts. And when was the last time you saw a presidential nominee stop in Idaho? I can't ever remember one stopping in Idaho, except maybe Frank Church. and no, he was a candidate at the time. He was a candidate. Well, maybe Romney did. But yeah, but I mean, they don't necessarily, they come in when they're primaried, right? Because that counts. On a Republican ticket, it counts.
William Jennings Bryan, really?
But anyway, I just think that we're at that era where a candidate has to campaign across the United States because every vote counts. And I think that is the game changer. Whereas, you know, candidates don't, if you're Republican, when I was in Oregon as news director in Portland, George W. Bush came and campaigned in Oregon, went to one county, Gore did, same county, because it was the swing county, and it wasn't the Portland county. But candidates don't go to, Republican candidates don't go to Oregon anymore because it's going to vote blue. So the people in Oregon, they not only don't get to see their candidate, but then when they cast their vote for the Republican candidate, it doesn't matter. Their vote really doesn't count. So anyway, I think that if we had a popular vote, every single vote in this country would count.
Well, it actually gets a response to another question that was on a note card, that the Electoral College was framed in a different era when a black person was 3/5 of a person. There was the desire to create this intricate balance nationally. Mm-hmm. So I think I'm hearing from you that you think the Electoral College has had its heyday and it was yesterday.
I do. And I also worry about democracy. How many elections? We've had two. How many elections have we had this century? 4 or 5, maybe. And at least 2 of them.
I studied history, not math, so.
Yeah, at least 2 just this century.
Yeah.
The person who won the popular vote did not win the presidency.
Yeah.
How long can a democracy last if that continues into this century? I mean, how can you say that we're truly a democracy if the person who wins the popular vote doesn't win the presidency?
Yep. There was a question about the deployment of the instrument. How did you select the recipients? How did you follow up with recipients that you selected that perhaps didn't respond? And then was there some vetting of whether or not these were likely voters because they had voted in the last election or not? There's a guy out there with research design or a lady out there with research design in their background.
That's a good question. Research design is true to my heart. So we worked with a firm out of Washington, D.C. called Morning Consult, and so they deployed the survey instrument. Idaho Policy Institute, we supplied technical assistance on the survey design, so the questions themselves. They used panels of representative samples of the individuals living in each of those states. So again, about 400 from each state provided for a representative sample of adults of voting age, so 18 or over in those states. They weren't, I don't think they were registered voters. Do you remember?
I can't remember, but
Yeah.
they were representative of the parties.
They were representative
like
of the party.
More Republicans were surveyed in Idaho than
Right.
Democrats.
So yeah, as far as I can't answer right now off the top of my head regarding the likelihood, all of the, so to create a panel, there's a bunch of qualifications people need to meet, and we didn't create the panel, that was Morning Consult.
So if I'm playing in design with you for just a quick moment, if there was sheer randomness in the selection of the respondents and they were proportional to the population, then theoretically the proportionality of those that vote and don't vote would be replicated in those that did respond. Or
And they're a pretty reputable firm back east. They do a lot of national polling for lots of different folks. I'm not, frankly, I look at these results, having followed Idaho politics for almost 50 years, I say I'm not really surprised by any of the results.
Well, this is a wonderful question, and I've been toying with it, and I think it's worth asking. It's going to be fun to hear the answer. If Trump had never been president, do you think the results would have been different?
You know, we've been coming, I think, we've been coming to this situation for a long, long time. I think Donald Trump was like gasoline on the fire. But, you know, I covered politics for a long time, and, you know, starting in the late 70s, 80 and onward, the politics of personal destruction has been just growing. President, you mentioned the 1994 election where Newt Gingrich became the speaker, and he had a scorched earth view of the world.
He surely did.
Yeah, and I think that we had problems in Congress before Newt, but we had people that worked across the aisle. Bob Dole, Howard Baker, Mike Mansfield, you know, Frank Church. I wrote the biography, co-authored the biography of Church. I covered him as a reporter. Almost every single piece of legislation he sponsored in his 24 years in the Senate was co-sponsored by a Republican. He was even appointed a chair by Mike Mansfield to chair a committee on presidential emergency powers. And Church said, I'll chair that, but I want a Republican to be my co-chair. So they appointed Mac Mathias from Maryland to be Church's co-chair. And there's a famous picture of Church and Mathias. They've got a gavel, and the gavel's cut right down the middle. Church is holding one side of the gavel, and Mac Mathias is holding the other half. And church always worked across the aisle. I could hardly think of any major initiative he did that he didn't have a Republican lead co-sponsor. And in those days, you know, you had Mark Hatfield working with church. You had John Sherman Cooper from Kentucky, all Republicans working with church. Jacob Javits from New York working with church. And that was true of the Republicans working with Democrats too, right? And there was a lot of bipartisanship. And I do think money has played a huge thing. The media has, of course, and all that. But back in the day, and I've had, you know, people like Jim McClure talk to me about this and others. Back in the 50s and 60s, they weren't out raising money all the time. Now, they're always raising money. And a lot of them are flying back home every weekend because their families don't want to move to Washington. But in the good old days, if they were good old days, you had a Democratic family go to a Republican's house on the weekend, and their kids would play together, they'd have a barbecue together, and the old saying that if you break bread with somebody, or your kids are playing with somebody on Saturday or Sunday, it's really hard to demonize that person on Monday, right? And we need these guys to stay in Washington. They need to have more barbecues with the other party. They need to go play softball with the other party, be on the same team with the other party. We need more relationships back there where people don't see each other as the enemy. They see people as people that just happen to have a different point of view. And you know, it is a mess back there. My big fear is that we're heading that same way in our states, and we're heading that same way in our local. Gosh, this last election in Idaho was a disaster, and I'd hate to see that same dysfunction start infecting our school boards and our city councils.
Got a question here that is about televised news and how we arrive at objective information. And I'm going to just contextualize this one a little bit. A few years ago, as the pandemic was raging and I was trying to figure out what to do every day, watch CNN in the morning, I get scared. Turn over to Fox News, I get scared. I just went to Bloomberg News and I learned about finances, and now I'm scared if I watch Bloomberg in the morning. So I watch Sky News and learn more about the European Central Bank than I ever want to know. Where's the Walter Cronkites of the world? Where's the David Brinkleys, the John Chancellors, the people that we used to be able to just turn it on and trust that they're telling us the right information? Where are the people that just tell us facts and not wrap all of the editorializing around it?
Yeah, this is a place where I have lots of strong opinions, obviously. So, you know, back when most of us were growing up, there were 3 networks, and we'd all gather around the hearth called the TV, and we'd have Cronkite or Brinkley and Huntley, Brinkley, or somebody read the news to us. And we had a lot of confidence in those folks, right? And what's happened in the media is a lot of bad things have happened. In 1988, we used to have something called the Fairness Doctrine. And when you're in broadcasting prior to 1988, if you had a Democrat on, you had to have a Republican on. If you had somebody espousing one idea, you had to have the other person espouse that idea too. I happened to be editorial page editor of the Statesman at the time, and Congress repealed the Fairness Doctrine. And we wrote an editorial in the Statesman opposing that. We felt like it was a real mistake to repeal the Fairness Doctrine. Ironically, about 6 months later, I became executive news director at KTVB, and my general manager loved the idea that they had repealed the Fairness Doctrine. But as a broadcaster of 23 years, I always followed the Fairness Doctrine. I would never, ever give anybody a megaphone. But one of the worst things that have ever happened to us as Americans is the invention of 24-hour news. And I'm kind of, you know, I actually, my last job in the media, I actually was the general manager, vice president of 2 24-hour news stations. But our stations were news-oriented. I mean, they were solid news-oriented, you know. But the worst thing that's ever happened to our country is the creation of Fox News, CNN started out as a very legitimate news organization, then Fox. Rupert Murdoch and Roger Ailes, they were laughing all the way to the bank, you guys. All the way to the bank. They saw a niche and they filled it. And they made tons and tons and billions of dollars off the American people by having a hotly conservative. And then CNN decided, or then NBC decided, well, we can make money too. So we're going to start one that leans to the left, right? And then you got CNN that was a pretty sleepy organization for a long time. They decided that they were going to get into the act. So what you've got is you've got all these for-profit 24-hour news stations that have their point of view, just like those early newspapers did in the beginning of our republic. And unfortunately, most of us watch the news that we agree with. And most of the news comes not from the New York Times. That was actually in our survey, wasn't it? Very few people in Idaho read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. They get most of their news from these 24-hour news stations. And what it is, it's an echo chamber. So you're watching my in-laws, who happen to live in the Magic Valley, lifelong Magic Valley people. You go into their house, and they always had Fox News on. And I don't think my father-in-law would ever watch CNN, but Fox News reinforced his points of view, right? And the same could be said if I went into another father-in-law's house and they had CNN on, and they've never had Fox News on. So 24-hour news has been the bane of our country, and I regret the day that we repealed the fairness doctrine.
So if the media and social media in particular is the new modern town square,
Yeah, it is.
or town hall,
And it's
how do we regulate it?
I don't think we can, because then the state has to be the regulator, and then you get the Soviet Union, you get that. I think education, how to read the media, how to be a critical thinker, how to know when people are pulling the wool over your eyes. But what I would like to see, but I'm not sure it's going to happen, and I know this sounds really self-serving, but I was trained to be a journalist. I went to school to be a journalist. I took ethics. I took law. Journalists, good journalists, are always trying to be balanced. They're always trying to be truthful. They're always trying to get the facts, and that's what they're trained to do. And I wish that Twitter and Facebook would apply some editorial judgment before they put things out to the public, and they had trained people who thought critically about what was going out there. You're never going to have a perfect system where somebody isn't the gatekeeper. But I'd much rather have trained journalists who are taught ethics, taught law, are taught to have a fair, balanced point of view. I'd much rather have them be the gatekeepers than some billionaire or some idiot that has no ethics, or somebody that has a political agenda, right? I'd much rather have gatekeepers that are at least trained, maybe not perfect, but are trained to be ethical.
So
Can I ask a
No.
question? What do you think about public media that's not privatized? So if you consider like National Public Radio or PBS, would you consider their news programs or their media different, or?
Yeah, they're the best, and I think in terms of point of view, although I think a lot of people see them as liberal, but the problem is that very few people watch public TV except for Downton Abbey. They don't watch, the network news and Fox and these other stations have millions more viewers than the PBS NewsHour. Really where the trouble is, in my view, is social media, Facebook, the way Google structures their thing. Twitter is a wasteland of misinformation. And 24-hour news, it's terrible. But because they're making so much money on it, you can't put Pandora back in the box, right? You just have to hope that some people with ethics ends up buying I don't know. I don't know how we're going to do it, but
So if we look before elections, because elections have consequences, some good, some bad, but if you look before the elections, how do we cultivate a society that the voters participate in meaningful ways in the election process and learn more? Because as I drive around the region, I drive down the interstate, highways, and I'm not making light of any of these. I see candidates, I see their name on the sign. I don't know more about that person because I see a sign. It just becomes name recognition. And I'm a transplant from Oklahoma, as many people know, and there was an insurance commissioner, a labor commissioner named John Doak. He had a clever jingle, John Doak, Okie Doke. He got elected. He was ultimately a good guy, as far as I know. But it's like, that doesn't tell us anything about the qualifications for candidacy and the worthiness to do the job.
Yeah.
How do we get people engaged in learning more about candidates rather than just...
well, I think, I represent Idaho Business for Education, and we're trying to build an educated and skilled workforce, and obviously, STEM is really important right now. Most of the jobs are going in that area. But, what we have forgotten are the humanities, that we need to teach starting in school a lot about civics and government, all the way through college. When I was in college, I majored in journalism and history. I majored in journalism because I knew I wanted to be a journalist. I majored in history because I wanted
like you
to
better.
understand.
I like you better now because of history. I didn't dislike you, but I like you better
And
now.
I majored in history. I considered journalism my craft. I considered history my academic degree because I wanted to understand the world. I wanted to be able to put events in perspective and context. And I think it made me a much better journalist. And I just wish that we would emphasize civics and history. History was one of the leading majors in the 60s and 50s. It is one of the fewest majors now. So there's been a flip-flop. And I think we need to start with education when it comes to civics and government. But I've been thinking a lot about this lately, and so I'm going to test some thoughts on this. I think the most important job any of us hold in life is citizen. And we have not been really great citizens on many levels. First of all, fewer and fewer of us are voting. Somebody told me that since 1980, we've only had 2 elections where more than 20% of Idahoans voted in the primary election. In 2020, 17% did. So it's hard to call that democracy when 17% of the people in Idaho are deciding, for all intents and purposes, who's going to govern our state, because the primary election in Idaho is essentially the general. So that means 17% of our citizens are deciding what laws we live under. That's not really a democracy anymore, but it's our fault because we're not voting. And so I think it starts in school, and we just have to take our job as citizens more seriously. We have to quit watching and reading what just reinforces our point of view. We have to think critically. When these candidates send this garbage to us in the mail, we should send it back and say, okay, tell me what you stand for, and tell me how you're going to improve my life and the life of the people around us. And I think that we've got to take our role as citizens much more seriously in this country. And we can start in our own state and our own communities. But, citizenship is the most important thing we do because it determines everything. Our future, especially our kids' future, and we want the very best for our kids, don't we? And we're not leaving them. My millennial kids they look at me and say, you've really screwed up our world. And, I have to say they're right. So those of us who have gray hair, we have a chance to redeem ourselves. And I hope we do.
Well, on the STEM education side of things, I think STEM is really important, of course, for our future, but we do need to provide an education more broadly. We're more than a vocational training ground, right? And which is fine, but how do we provide the information about what is government? What does it mean? How do you participate in it? That civic education piece. If you don't understand how it works, you're not going to trust it, right? You're not going to understand it. And we're not going to have good leaders in our local government. And not just the people we vote, government's run by people behind the scenes, those bureaucrats. And, how do we make that an attractive profession and teach people about the opportunity they have to have positive impact when they're in the public sector?
I do have good news here for those of us who really love the humanities. So Tony Wagner, he's left Harvard, but he was a Harvard professor in the business school. And he went out a few years ago to talk to CEOs about what skills that the CEOs of America's corporate companies wanted. And he expected them to say, well, I want more engineers, I want more, finance guys and stuff. Every CEO wanted to talk about what I call durable skills. And then Tony went back and he rewrote his whole book on this, and he came up with 7 durable skills, or what he called life skills. I call them durable skills. I call them durable skills because they're the skills that you gain and they never change. We know that engineering's always changing, technology's always changing. All those things are changing like lightning speed, but these durable skills never do. And among them is critical thinking, the ability to communicate both orally and in writing, believe that, writing, collaboration, working with other people, and integrity, all rated really high with these CEOs. And when you think about the humanities, that's all the humanities: critical thinking, writing, speaking, collaborating. All those skills are things that the employers want, and they are all tied back to humanities. That's where you learn those things, is in the humanities. And so I think that it's time to have a renaissance of the humanities, and it's going to make us better citizens.
So we'd all be Renaissance people? Just like Da Vinci?
It would be perfect.
Well, this is a rather apocalyptic question. What would have to happen for democracy to end, and what would replace it?
Well, and Vanessa can weigh in on this. There are these 2 professors from Harvard who've spent 30 years studying democracies and democracy's demise. So it's not a new issue for them, and they have a metrics of how democracies die. And if you want a book, they've written a book called "How Democracies Die," and they've studied this for decades. And we in the United States are starting to check the box on a lot of the metrics that they've observed in other countries when their democracies die. And there's a time after the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union divided in the early 90s when we thought that democracy would be on the rise across the world. But there's an organization called Freedom House, and every year they put out a study on state of democracies and freedom around the world. And steadily over the last several years, democracies have been dying, democracies have been weakened, and more and more countries are seeing a decline in democracy, including in the United States. So it is not inconceivable, under the right conditions, if this keeps going the way it's going, that we will lose our democracy. And you remember the famous, Ben Franklin left the Constitutional Convention, and a woman stopped him and said, "Dr. Franklin, what do we have, a monarchy or a republic?" And he answered, "We have a republic if you can keep it." And every generation, and I think Reagan said this, every generation has to fight for democracy and freedom. And we're checking those boxes on that metric about the decline of democracy in this country.
Yeah, Sir Winston Churchill was much more eloquent than I'm about to be, because I don't remember his exact words, but basically he said democracy is the best form of government, that it's the worst form of government, but we haven't found anything better.
Right.
Something akin to that. What about libel laws? Do we need to strengthen libel laws in social media space? I know that that gets into another dimension of regulation, but when we know that people are spreading untruths, do they just have free reign of the megaphone to?
Well, I would just say you're going to have a lot of politicians in prison if you. But you want to answer this question?
No, I just think that, you know, we want to allow for free speech, right? And how, at what point in time, and rarely do we say that someone can't say something,
Yeah.
right? Even if they are calling someone a crook, right? The opponent who they maybe were friends with and maybe they did go to the barbecue with them, but they want to win, and so they're using this language that traditionally would likely be considered libel, and they're not held accountable for it.
But, you know, we've really turned a corner when people with a straight face can say that the storming of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th was an expression of free speech, or when these terrible people are showing up at school board, you know, up in Coeur d'Alene, they stormed the Coeur d'Alene School District last fall. And the school board had to stop the meeting. The police had to come in to keep the school board members from being mobbed. And then, so they left. And then the mob thought that the school board had gone back to the district office, and they stormed the district office up in Coeur d'Alene, where I've been. And the police had to come and escort the employees of the school district out of the building. That's not free speech. That's mob violence, or showing up at, you know, Diana Lacciondo's house last year. Diana Lacciondo's dad was a longtime educator. He got an award before he died just recently from the Humanities Council for his work in the Basque community. In fact, Diana's grandfather was from Twin Falls here and made churritos here in Twin Falls. Diana was at a county commission meeting and
Public health district meeting.
District health meeting, and this mob showed up in front of her house. Her husband's a doctor, so he's at St. Luke's taking care of COVID patients. Diana's at Central District Health representing the county commissioners. Her mom was taking care of her two little boys. One's 12, one is like 10, and stormed her house. Her mom, this is a long story, but her mom had just stepped out of the house to go a couple houses down, where she was meeting another widow whose husband, ironically, died of the same disease that Dave died of. And they were walking back to Diana's house when they saw the mob. And those kids were scared to death because they were alone for a few minutes. But anyway, and they called that free speech.
Well, and I would not, so I'm friends with Diana, our kids are the same age. I wouldn't want that to happen to my kids. Why would I put myself and my children at risk? So if you think of, you know, who wants to run for office, even a local office like a county commissioner, with fear of a potentially violent group of people on your front lawn. Yeah. I mean, the current Boise mayor has a police detail, right? Like that hasn't been something that has been in the past. Never. She can't go on a run by herself because of the death threat she's received, right?
So we have to, as citizens, we have to say this is not normal. And we should not tolerate it. We should not. It's indecent. It's not ethical. It's not free speech. But I guess you can enforce some laws, like folks getting prosecuted for January 6th, right? But nobody's been prosecuted for closing down St. Luke's Hospital a few weeks ago, and people that needed to go to the ER had to be diverted to a different hospital. Hopefully, none of them died. But anyway, we used to have some standards in this country, and we don't have any standards anymore.
there's a comment that is on this card, and I'll make it into a question.
Okay.
And then we'll do some wrap up. The author of this card remarks that he or she has always found it easier to find common ground if they do a lot of things outside of the political space with a person. Talk about, get to know them outside of a political environment, political dimension, and then it comes together easier when you like the person, and then you can tolerate the politics, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Do you see hope for us to be able to begin to do that better?
Yeah, and that's really where I lie. I thrive on meeting people that are different than me. I think it's boring if I'm around a lot of people like myself. I don't like the echo chamber. I want to learn more, right? And so I always say this to my students, you can find something in common with any person you meet. And I truly believe that around the globe, there's something that you have in common. Where we're trying to start is in a place of conflict. We haven't given ourselves an opportunity to know our neighbors, right? To know the people that are sitting across the aisle, like Rod was talking about. So how do we all, individually, this is something we can choose to do, right? We can't force our elected officials to move their families to Washington and have those barbecues. But how can we demonstrate the type of leadership that we want to see in our community, starting with ourselves, getting together with different groups, introducing our kids to different types of people, different churches, like go to a different church one day and meet a different group of people, right? Stretching our comfort zone to some extent, but when we break bread with people, it's going to be a lot easier for us to have empathy and respect for where that person's coming from.
Yeah, it's all about relationships, really, whether it's a marriage, a business, school, or, a community, if you've got to have strong relationships with people, and that means getting to know them. And one of the things I loved about being a journalist for almost 4 decades was, I had, I don't know if I'd call them friends, but I had relationships with Republicans, relationships with Democrats, and many I'd call friends. I just finished a book with Governor Batt, and a person I truly admire greatly. And so, as a journalist, you always have to develop a relationship with people of both parties, and that's one of the things I really enjoyed because, I had those relationships with both Republicans and Democrats throughout my career.
I think one other thing I want to add is that approaching other people with curiosity instead of blame. Right, so Stephen Covey would say, seek first to understand, then to be understood. I don't have a place to say that people who think violence is okay, that they're wrong. I want to know why they think that violence is okay. They feel so strongly about something, they think violence is the answer. Well, what is it they're feeling so strongly about? Is it the mistrust? Do they feel like they're not getting heard and violence is the only way to achieve getting their voice out? How do we address that underlying issue? And that's going to take a lot of work collectively and as individuals, but I think that's part of it. Having empathy for people that might be quite different than us is very difficult, and not coming out right and saying you're wrong, but maybe trying to seek to understand why they are where they are.
Yeah, and just something else I've been thinking about a lot is that there's a lot of pain in this country, because of technological changes, manufacturing going overseas, moving from coal and oil to a different sort of energy basis, all kinds of change. We're constantly changing, and then you throw the cultural wars in too. And there's just so much pain in our country. And there's an old saying that if you don't transform your pain, you transmit your pain. And I think there are a lot of people that are transmitting their pain to other people on both sides of the thing. And I think that we have to have empathy and compassion that a lot of our fellow citizens are hurting right now from the changes and lots of things going on in our country.
One of my work styles is that I'll pull out my phone in the morning when I get to the office early and start working on emails, and I launch my Pandora channel, which probably is labeled old guys music somewhere in Pandora's database. But the other morning, Sting, one of his songs began streaming, and some of you might know the song Russians by Sting. And there's, he was doing it within the context of the Cold War, and there was a line in that song, "Don't you think the Russians love their children too?" And that was what came to my mind when you were talking about the commonality. If nothing else, we're just simply on this same big ball circling around the sun, trying to make it all work. And so I would like to think that whatever political affiliation one has, we probably all love our children and our family too. And there's some things that we can come together for commonality. So as some wrap-up thoughts, I want to make sure that I offer some quick thanks to Rod and Vanessa. Thank you for making the journey out here. I think you're at least sleeping in Twin Falls tonight, and I think that you are. You're driving back? Okay, well, be safe.
Because I love my children.
Okay.
And so I'm going home to them.
Well, be safe and enjoy tomorrow.
And my
and
children
swim.
are out of the nest, so I don't have to worry. I actually have a meeting down here tomorrow, and the CSI is graciously hosting us.
I also want to thank Carolyn White, who came out of her semi-retirement and helped retirement and helped to organize this. Dr. Frost and Dr. Tremaine are the two folks that were part of the steering committee from the City Club. And if I missed anybody else in the room that, oh, I'm sorry, Rich, I didn't see you. Sorry. Okay, well, thank you all. Thank you all. I'm not trying to neglect you. Thank you all. And thank you for the folks from the Herrit and from our marketing and communication team for putting this all together. There were about 12 folks watching online, so those 12 souls never put a question in the chat box or the inbox until I got up here. So they lost their prerogative when I walked over here to the microphone. But would you help me collectively thank the folks from Herrit and marketing and communication, Carolyn and Rod and Vanessa. Well, I suppose my title of president allows me to provide some direction. I'm sure that Rod and Vanessa would be happy to stay around and answer questions. Rod more so because he's staying here, and Vanessa has some children that she dearly loves that she wants to get back to. So she's your ride. Okay. Well, we are adjourned. Thank you all for being here.
Yeah. Yeah, we can. We need to get our picture.
Oh, that'd be great.
Which I need to solicit someone